My daughter-in-law left me to care for her sick husband while she traveled with her friends, saying, "He'll still be here when I come back." 2 days later, he was gone. She returned expecting an inheritance. Instead, she found a little surprise on the table. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morphine pump clicked its mechanical rhythm beside Bill's hospital bed, each soft beep marking another moment stolen from what little time we had left. I smoothed the blanket over his chest, watching the shallow rise and fall that had become our shared metronome these past 3 weeks. At 38, my son looked older than his father ever had, cancer having carved deep lines around his eyes that spoke of pain I couldn't touch. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of machines. "Where's Stephanie?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. I adjusted his pillows, buying myself seconds to craft an answer that wouldn't shatter what remained of his faith in the woman he'd married 5 years ago. Stephanie, who had kissed his forehead 3 days earlier and announced she was taking that long-planned trip to Europe with her college friends. Stephanie, who had looked me straight in the eye and said, "He'll still be here when I come back, won't he, Angelica? She's traveling, sweetheart. Remember, the trip to Paris she's been planning." Bill's fingers found mine, surprisingly strong for someone dissolving before my eyes. "I need to tell you something. About the house. About everything." My heart clenched. The house. Our family home on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where Bill had taken his first steps, where his father had taught him to ride a bike in the driveway. The house that had been in our family for 38 years. Where every room held memories that Stephanie had been eager to inventory even before the diagnosis became terminal. "Don't worry about that now," I said, though worry was exactly what I'd been doing. Stephanie had made her intentions clear from the moment the oncologist used the word months. She'd started talking about redecorating, about selling this and keeping that, about how the house would need a woman's touch once she inherited it, as if I were already dead and buried alongside my son. "No, Mom. Listen." Bill struggled to sit up, and I helped him, noting how his wedding ring now slipped loose on his finger. "I changed things. Last week, when you were getting my prescriptions. I called Curtis Fay. You remember, Dad's old lawyer?" A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. "Bill, what did you do?" What I should have done months ago. His eyes, still that brilliant blue despite everything, held a clarity I hadn't seen in weeks. "I know what she's been saying to you. I know how she looks at you, like you're just taking up space until I'm gone." The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. Stephanie had never been cruel exactly, but she had a way of making me feel like an inconvenience in my own son's life. The subtle sighs when I offered to help with dinner, the way she'd redirect conversations when I started telling stories about Bill's childhood. The gentle but firm suggestions that maybe I should consider exploring my options for senior living communities. "She doesn't mean anything by it," I said, the lie tasting bitter. "She asked me last month if you had any other family, any other place you could go." Bill's voice grew stronger, fueled by something I couldn't quite name. "She said it would be healthier for both of us if you had your own space. That watching me die was probably traumatic for someone your age. Someone my age. At 64, I had buried my husband, raised my son through college, worked 30 years as a middle school librarian, and somehow retained enough strength to sit vigil beside my dying child's bed while his wife toured European museums. But to Stephanie, I was simply someone whose age made me fragile, inconvenient, expendable. What did you tell her? That you were my mother, and this was your home too. That when Dad died, he left the house to both of us, and I would never ask you to leave." Bill paused, breathing carefully. "But she kept pushing, said it wasn't fair to burden you with caregiving, said you deserved to enjoy your golden years, somewhere designed for people your age." I wanted to tell him that my golden years weren't some separate phase of life happening in a facility with scheduled activities and pureed vegetables. My golden years were sitting in the garden my husband had planted, reading in the armchair where I'd nursed Bill through chicken pox, cooking Sunday dinners in the kitchen where 3 generations of our family had gathered. My golden years were supposed to include watching my son grow old, not watching him disappear. "So, what did you do?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Bill had inherited his father's sense of justice, his quiet way of making decisions that spoke louder than arguments. I signed new papers. The house goes to you free and clear. No joint ownership, no contingencies. And the life insurance, all of it goes to you too. He squeezed my hand. She doesn't know yet. I was waiting for the right time to tell her. The machines continued their steady chorus, but something had shifted in the room. I thought about Stephanie's credit card bills scattered across the kitchen counter at home, the ones I'd glimpsed while cleaning. The new car she'd purchased last month, the expensive clothes still hanging in their bedroom with tags attached, the way she'd been spending money like someone who knew exactly how much was coming in. Bill, are you sure? She's your wife. You love her. I do love her. He closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he'd drifted off again. Then, but love doesn't mean being stupid. She hasn't been here, Mom. Not really. Not when it mattered. The truth of it settled over us like snow, quiet and undeniable. In the 3 weeks since Bill had been admitted for this final stay, Stephanie had visited exactly 6 times. Twice to sign paperwork the doctors required from his spouse. Once to collect clothes from his bedside table. Designer clothes she'd bought him that he'd never be well enough to wear again. 3 times to discuss practical matters like funeral arrangements and estate planning, conversations that always ended with her stepping into the hallway to take calls about dinner reservations and shopping plans. Meanwhile, I had slept in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed every night, learned to read the monitors that tracked his vital signs, memorized the names and schedules of every nurse on the floor. I had held basins when he was sick, adjusted his blankets countless times throughout each night, and sat in silence when words felt too heavy for the space between us. She'll be angry, I said. Let her be angry. Bill opened his eyes and looked directly at me. You've given up everything to be here. Your book club, your volunteer work at the library, your whole life. She gave up a vacation she can take any time. I thought about the book club I'd missed for 3 weeks running, about the literacy program I'd abandoned mid-semester to be here, about the small routines that had kept me grounded since Joel died 4 years ago, about how Stephanie had never once offered to take a shift so I could go home and shower properly, or sleep in my own bed, or tend to the garden that was probably overrun with weeds by now. When will you tell her? When she gets back. If... He trailed off, but we both knew what he meant. If he was still here when she returned from her European adventure. The sunset outside the hospital window painted everything in shades of amber and rose, the kind of light that made even this sterile room feel momentarily beautiful. I had spent so many evenings like this, watching the day end while keeping vigil beside someone I loved. First with Joel during his last months with heart disease, now with Bill. It occurred to me that I had become expert at saying goodbye, at being the one who stayed until the end. Are you scared, Mom? Bill asked suddenly. Of what? Of being alone. Really alone. This time. The question caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because no one had ever asked me directly. After Joel died, people had assumed I would be fine. After all, I was capable, independent, had my son nearby. Now, with Bill dying, people would assume I'd figure something out. Move somewhere smaller, maybe. Find new ways to fill my time. Adjust to being the last one left standing in a family that had once filled every room of our house with laughter and argument and love. I don't know, I said honestly. But I know I'm not scared of her. Bill smiled for the first time in days. Good. Because what I did, it's going to change everything. She's been planning on that house. On that money. She's been counting on it. I know. And you deserve it. You've earned it. Dad would have wanted you to have it. The mention of Joel brought tears I'd been holding back for weeks. He would have been furious at Stephanie's behavior, would have confronted her directly instead of enduring her subtle dismissals and gentle condescension. But Joel wasn't here to protect me anymore, and Bill wouldn't be either. What if she fights it? I asked. She can try. But Curtis Fay knows our family, knows what Dad would have wanted. The papers are ironclad. Bill's breathing grew more labored, and I could see the conversation was exhausting him. Besides, she'll have other things to worry about. What do you mean? Those credit cards she thinks I don't know about. the loans she took out for her BMW, which I co-signed, the money she borrowed from her mother, promising she'd pay it back after. He gestured weakly around the room. After all this was over. My stomach dropped. How much money, Bill? Enough that she can't afford to fight a legal battle she won't win. He closed his eyes again. I'm tired, Mom. But I needed you to know. I needed you to be ready. I sat in the growing darkness, listening to my son's breathing slow into the rhythm of sleep, trying to process what he'd told me. Tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever Stephanie decided to cut short her European vacation, she would return expecting to inherit everything my family had built over 4 decades. Instead, she would find herself financially responsible for debts she'd accumulated in secret, while the woman she'd treated as a burden inherited the security she'd counted on. The justice of it should have felt satisfying. Instead, I felt only a deep sadness for the son who had been forced to choose between his wife and his mother, and who had chosen the woman who had actually stood by him when it mattered. Outside, the hospital settled into its nighttime quiet, and I pulled my sweater closer around my shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations with doctors who spoke in careful euphemisms about making him comfortable and managing expectations. But tonight, I would sit here beside my dying son and know that for the first time in months, someone had chosen me. That knowledge felt both precious and terrifying, because soon I would have to be strong enough to stand alone with it. The morphine pump clicked again, and Bill stirred slightly in his sleep. I reached for his hand. Still warm, still real, still mine for whatever time remained. And in the darkness beyond the hospital window, Stephanie's plane was somewhere over the Atlantic, carrying her toward a future that would be nothing like what she'd planned. Bill died on a Tuesday morning while Stephanie was photographing the Eiffel Tower. I knew because she posted the picture on Facebook at 11:47 a.m., captioned, "Living my best life in the city of light," with 3 heart emojis. Bill drew his last breath at 11:52 a.m., his hand still wrapped around mine, his face finally peaceful after weeks of fighting a battle he could never win. The nurse, a kind woman named Lucy who had worked this floor longer than my son had been alive, gently closed his eyes and asked if I wanted to call anyone. I stared at my phone, at Stephanie's smiling face posed against the iron latticework of Paris's most famous landmark, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. "Not yet," I said. The next few hours passed in a strange, suspended reality. Paperwork to sign, belongings to collect, decisions about funeral arrangements that felt both urgent and utterly meaningless. I moved through it all with mechanical precision, my grief locked away in a place I couldn't access yet. There would be time for falling apart later. Right now, I had work to do. Curtis Fay arrived within 2 hours of my call, carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to his father, and wearing the same serious expression he'd worn to Joel's funeral 4 years earlier. We met in the hospital's family conference room, a beige space designed to contain the worst conversations families ever had to have. "I'm sorry for your loss, Angelica," he said, settling his bulk into one of the uncomfortable chairs. Bill was a good man. Joel would have been proud of the choices he made. Even the recent ones? Curtis's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. Especially the recent ones. That boy finally found his backbone. He opened the briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "Everything's in order, just like he wanted. The house is yours, free and clear. The life insurance, all $150,000, comes to you as the primary beneficiary. His 401k, his bank accounts, everything. And Stephanie gets exactly what she brought to the marriage. Nothing." Curtis's tone was matter-of-fact, but I caught the satisfaction underneath. He'd never liked Stephanie, had warned Bill before the wedding that a woman who wouldn't sign a prenup was a woman with plans for your money. She won't just accept this quietly. She doesn't have a choice. Iowa is a separate property state, and Bill never added her name to anything that mattered. The house was yours and his from his father's estate. The insurance was a policy he'd had since college. She was never on it. The only thing with both their names was the checking account, and that's got about $400 in it. $400. I thought about the credit card bills I'd seen scattered across the kitchen table. The new BMW in our driveway that Stephanie had purchased without consulting Bill. The designer handbags and shoes that filled half their bedroom closet. $400 wouldn't cover a single night at whatever Parisian hotel she was currently enjoying. What about her debts? Curtis's expression darkened. That's where it gets interesting. Bill did some digging after you mentioned seeing those bills. Turns out she's been living quite the lifestyle on the assumption that she'd inherit everything. Credit cards maxed out to about $40,000. A personal loan from her mother for $25,000 that she promised to pay back soon. And then there's the car loan she co-signed with Bill last month. How much is the car loan? $63,000. For a car that's already depreciated to maybe $50,000. The numbers felt surreal, like we were discussing someone else's life, someone else's financial recklessness. But they were real, and in a few days, when Stephanie returned from her European adventure, they would become her reality alone. She'll come to the house, I said. Probably. And when she does, you'll be ready. Curtis slid another set of papers across the table. Restraining order, if you need it. Bill was worried she might not take the news well. I stared at the legal documents, each page representing my son's final act of protection for the mother who had raised him, loved him, and refused to abandon him even when his wife had. The weight of his love felt almost unbearable. There's one more thing, Curtis said gently. Bill left you a letter. Asked me to give it to you afterward. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, the kind of stationery Bill had always favored for important occasions. My name was written across it in his careful handwriting, though the letters shook slightly, evidence of the weakness that had claimed him piece by piece. Do you want privacy to read it? No. I'll wait until I get home. Home. The word felt different now, weighted with new meaning. For the first time in 5 years, it would truly be mine again. No more tiptoeing around Stephanie's moods. No more pretending not to notice when she rearranged my furniture or threw away my belongings without asking. No more being made to feel like a guest in the house my husband and I had bought in 1986, when Bill was just a baby and the world still felt full of possibilities. Curtis helped me gather Bill's things. So few belongings to represent 38 years of life. His watch, the one Joel had given him for graduation. His wallet, still containing the picture of Stephanie from their honeymoon, back when she'd looked at him like he hung the moon. A book of poetry he'd been reading, pages marked with careful annotations in his precise handwriting. The drive home from Cedar Falls Regional Hospital took 12 minutes, a route I'd traveled countless times over the past month. But everything looked different now, as if Bill's death had altered the very landscape. The familiar streets of my neighborhood seemed quieter, the houses more distant from each other. Even my own driveway, when I finally pulled into it, felt like foreign territory. The house stood exactly as I'd left it that morning, when I'd still been a mother with a living son. Stephanie's BMW gleamed in the late afternoon sun, a monument to financial irresponsibility that would soon become her primary asset and burden. I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the front door, trying to prepare myself for the silence that waited inside. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the soup I'd made 3 days ago, before everything changed. Stephanie's credit card bills were still scattered across the table where she'd left them, mixed now with sympathy cards that had started arriving from neighbors who'd heard the news. I gathered the bills into a neat stack, reading the amounts with new eyes. Nordstrom, $3,247. American Express, $8,891. Victoria's Secret, $1,205. Each charge dated within the past 2 months, while Bill had been fighting for his life. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table with Bill's letter. The envelope opened easily, revealing 3 pages of his careful script. Dear Mom, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but mostly I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what Stephanie was doing to you, to us. I thought marriage meant loyalty to your spouse above all else, but I was wrong. Marriage should never mean abandoning the people who loved you first, who stood by you when the world fell apart, who never asked for anything except the chance to keep loving you. Stephanie isn't a bad person, but she's a selfish one. She sees you as an obstacle to the life she wants, and I can't leave this world knowing she's going to push you out of your own home. Dad would never forgive me, and neither would I. The house is yours. The money is yours. Use both to build whatever life makes you happy. Travel if you want to. Stay put if that feels better. Adopt 17 cats. Start a business. Fall in love again. Do whatever brings you joy because you've earned it. Don't feel guilty about Stephanie. She made her choices, and now she gets to live with them. You don't owe her anything. Not kindness, not money, not even an explanation. You certainly don't owe her forgiveness. I love you, Mom. Thank you for everything, especially for staying until the end. Bill P.S. There's something hidden in Dad's old toolbox in the garage. You'll know what to do with it. By the time I finished reading, my tea had grown cold, and the kitchen had filled with shadows. I folded the letter carefully, placing it back in its envelope, then walked to the garage where Joel's red Craftsman toolbox still sat on his workbench, exactly where he'd left it the day before his heart attack. The main compartments held the usual assortment of screwdrivers and wrenches, measuring tapes and sandpaper, all coated with the fine layer of dust that accumulates on things that used to matter. But in the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old dish towel, I found a manila envelope containing $23,000 in cash, Joel's emergency fund, the money he'd saved over decades of careful living, setting aside $20 or $50 whenever he could, preparing for some undefined crisis that never came. Money he'd never told me about because he'd wanted me to feel secure without knowing exactly how he'd made that security possible. I sat on Joel's old stool, surrounded by his tools and the ghost of his cologne, holding more cash than I'd ever seen in one place. Bill had known about this, had probably helped his father count it during those long conversations they'd had in the garage when Bill was younger. Father teaching son about the importance of being prepared, of taking care of the people you loved, even after you were gone. The money felt like a message from both of them, a reminder that I was not powerless, not dependent, not the burden Stephanie had made me feel like. I was a woman with choices, with resources, with the strength that comes from being loved by good men who had thought carefully about my future. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at the screen to see Stephanie's name. The message was brief, almost casual. Having an amazing time. Bill feeling better? Back Thursday night. Love you both. Love you both. As if love were a casual sentiment tossed across an ocean, as if her absence during her husband's final days could be erased with heart emojis and exclamation points. I looked around the garage, at Joel's workbench where he'd fixed countless broken things, at the corner where Bill had practiced guitar during high school, driving us all crazy with his endless repetition of Stairway to Heaven. Every inch of this space held memories that Stephanie had never been part of, would never understand. Thursday night. She would return expecting to find Bill either recovered or at least stable, ready to resume the routine of her carefully managed life. Instead, she would find a widow with $40,000 in debt and no inheritance to cushion the fall. I should have felt sorry for her. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. But sitting there in the golden light of late afternoon, surrounded by the tools and treasures of 2 generations of men who had loved me enough to plan for my protection, I felt something harder and more final than sympathy. I felt justice. That night, I called the funeral home and made arrangements for a simple service. I called Bill's employer and spoke to his supervisor, a kind man who promised to handle the paperwork for his final benefits. I called my sister in Phoenix, who cried with me over the phone and offered to fly out for the funeral. What I didn't do was call Stephanie, let her finish her vacation, post her pictures, enjoy her last few days of thinking she'd married well and planned wisely. Let her return to a world that had shifted completely in her absence, just as she'd shifted away from us when we needed her most. Justice, I was learning, sometimes looked like silence. Sometimes it looked like allowing people to discover the consequences of their choices without warning, without mercy, without the soft cushion of someone else's protection. Bill had given me that gift. The gift of watching someone who had taken everything for granted learn what it felt like to lose it all. And I intended to savor every moment of it. Stephanie's key turned in the front door at 9:23 p.m. on Thursday, her Louis Vuitton suitcase wheels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown timer. I sat in Joel's old recliner in the living room, the lamp beside me casting a pool of warm light that didn't quite reach the corners where shadows gathered like witnesses. "Hello?" she called, her voice bright with the artificial cheer of someone returning from vacation. "I'm back. Where is everyone?" I didn't answer immediately. Let her set down her bags, kick off her expensive shoes, notice the unusual quiet that filled our house like water in a sinking ship. Let her wonder why no one had rushed to greet her, why the television wasn't playing Bill's favorite cooking shows, why the air felt different. "Angelica." Her voice carried a note of uncertainty now. "Is Bill sleeping?" "Stephanie." I kept my voice level, gave nothing away. "Come sit down." She appeared in the doorway of the living room, still glowing with European sun and wearing a silk scarf that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Her smile faltered when she saw my expression, the careful neutrality I'd practiced in the mirror for the past 2 days. "Where's Bill?" she asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew. "Bill died Tuesday morning, while you were taking pictures." The words hit her like a physical blow. She grabbed the doorframe, her face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been guilt. But not grief. Not yet. Grief would come later, when she had time to process what she'd lost beyond a husband. "Tuesday? But I just talked to him on Monday. He seemed better. The nurse said he was stable." "Stable isn't the same as recovering." I watched her carefully, noting how her first instinct was to defend her absence rather than mourn his presence. "He asked for you." "Several times." She sank onto the couch across from me, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. "I need to. There must be arrangements. The funeral. Already handled. Service is Saturday at St. Mark's. Burial next to his father at Graceland Cemetery. But I should have been the one to. I'm his wife." His wife was in Paris. The harshness in my voice surprised us both. For 5 years, I had swallowed every slight, every dismissal, every subtle indication that Stephanie considered me surplus to their life together. But sitting in my own living room, looking at a woman who had prioritized Instagram photos over her dying husband's final days, I found I had no patience left for politeness. "Angelica, I know you're upset, but you don't understand. This trip was planned for months. Bill insisted I go. He said he wanted me to have good memories before." She gestured helplessly. "He said he'd be fine. He lied to make you feel better about abandoning him." Stephanie's composure cracked. "I didn't abandon him. I was coming back. I cut the trip short. I was supposed to stay another week." "You cut it short because he died, not because he needed you." She stared at me as if I'd slapped her, which perhaps I had. But we were past the point of gentle truths and careful words. Bill was gone, and with him, my willingness to pretend that Stephanie's behavior had been anything less than selfish. "I loved him," she said quietly. "I'm sure you did. In your way." "What's that supposed to mean?" I leaned forward, studying her face in the lamplight. Even crying, even shocked, she was beautiful. The kind of effortless beauty that had always opened doors for her, smoothed rough edges, made people want to take care of her problems. But beauty wouldn't help her with what was coming. "It means love isn't just a feeling, Stephanie. It's a choice you make every day. It's showing up when showing up is hard. It's staying when staying hurts. I stayed for 2 years. 2 years of hospitals and treatments and watching him get sicker. And then you left when it mattered most." She fumbled in her purse for tissues, her movements uncharacteristically clumsy. "I needed a break. Do you know how exhausting it is, watching someone you love die? Do you know what that does to a person?" The question hung between us like a challenge. Did I know? I had watched my husband deteriorate for 8 months, held his hand through his last breath, then buried him and somehow found the strength to keep living. I had spent the last month watching my son follow the same path, sleeping in hospital chairs, and learning to read the language of medical equipment that measured the distance between life and death. "Yes," I said simply. "I do know." Something in my tone must have warned her, because her crying stopped abruptly. She looked around the room as if seeing it clearly for the first time, noting the neat stacks of papers on the coffee table, the manila envelope beside my chair, the careful way I'd positioned myself in Joel's chair like a queen holding court. What's going on, Angelica? Bill left some things for you to review. I picked up the envelope Curtis Fay had prepared, noting how Stephanie's eyes tracked the movement like a predator watching prey. Legal documents, his will, some other paperwork you'll need to understand. She took the envelope with trembling fingers, and I watched her face change as she read. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a dawning horror that transformed her features into something sharp and desperate. This can't be right. The house, the insurance. This says everything goes to you. That's correct. But I'm his wife. I'm his next of kin. You're his widow. There's a difference. Stephanie shot to her feet, the papers scattering across the coffee table like oversized confetti. This is insane. He can't just cut me out. We were married. I have rights. You have the right to whatever you brought to the marriage, which, as I recall, was a bachelor's degree in communications and about $3,000 in credit card debt. I kept my voice calm, almost conversational. Of course, the debt situation seems to have evolved somewhat since then. Her face went white. What do you mean? I mean the $40,000 you owe on credit cards, the $25,000 you borrowed from your mother, the car loan that's now entirely your responsibility. I smiled, and it felt like flexing a muscle I'd forgotten I had. Did you really think Bill didn't know? Did you think you could spend money like that without him noticing? Those were investments. Things we needed for the house, for our future. Whose future, Stephanie? Because it looks to me like you were investing in a future that assumed my son would die and leave you everything. She began pacing, her movements sharp and agitated. You poisoned him against me. You never liked me, and you turned him against his own wife. I didn't have to turn him against anything. You did that yourself when you decided a vacation was more important than being with him when he died. He told me to go. He insisted. Because he loved you enough to let you choose, and you chose Paris. The truth of it settled over the room like dust. Stephanie stopped pacing, her shoulders sagging as the full weight of her situation became clear. No inheritance, no financial cushion. Nothing but debts she'd accumulated and a car she couldn't afford to keep making payments on. What am I supposed to do? She whispered. It was the question I'd been waiting for. The moment when the woman who had spent 5 years making me feel unwelcome in my own home would have to ask for help from the person she'd dismissed as irrelevant. I imagine you'll figure something out. You're a capable woman. Angelica, please. I know we haven't always gotten along, but we're family now. We're all each other has left. Family. The word felt like a joke. Family was what Bill and I had been, sitting beside his hospital bed while she posed for photographs. Family was what Joel and I had built over 27 years of marriage, what we'd passed down to our son. Family wasn't something you claimed when it became convenient. We were never family, Stephanie. We were 2 women who loved the same man. But the funeral, I need to be able to afford. And the house payments on our apartment lease ran out last month because I thought we'd be living here permanently after. She trailed off, realizing what she'd just admitted. The apartment lease. She'd been planning to move into my house, had probably already given notice to her landlord, had counted on inheriting a mortgage-free home and enough insurance money to live comfortably for years. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay, I said. Tonight. Tonight? But my things. All my clothes are upstairs. Pack what you need. You can collect the rest this weekend with supervision. Stephanie's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. You can't throw me out. I just lost my husband. You lost your husband Tuesday morning. I lost my son. There's a difference in how we're choosing to handle that loss. She stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in 5 years. Not the convenient caregiver, not the aging mother-in-law who could be gently managed and eventually relocated. Just a woman who had been underestimated for too long. You planned this, she said slowly. You and Bill. You planned this whole thing. Bill planned it. I'm just honoring his wishes. He was on morphine. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was thinking more clearly than he had in months. Pain has a way of showing you what really matters. Stephanie grabbed her purse, her movements now sharp with anger rather than grief. I'll fight this. I'll get a lawyer. You can't just steal everything that should have been mine. With what money? The question stopped her cold. Your credit cards are maxed out. Your mother's loan won't cover legal fees. and most lawyers want payment up front for estate disputes. She stood there in my living room, designer clothes and all, looking more lost than I'd ever seen her. For just a moment, I felt something that might have been pity, but then I remembered Bill asking where she was, remembered the loneliness in his voice, and the feeling passed. "There's a Holiday Inn on Highway 218, I said. "They have weekly rates. Angelica, please. I'm sorry about the timing. I'm sorry I wasn't here. But I can't just start over with nothing. I'm 32 years old. How am I supposed to rebuild my entire life? 32 years old. The same age I'd been when Joel and I bought this house, when we'd had nothing but love and determination and the willingness to work for what we wanted. The same age I'd been when I'd thought the future stretched endlessly ahead, when loss was something that happened to other people, the same way everyone else does," I said, "one day at a time." She stood there for another moment, perhaps waiting for me to relent, to offer some compromise that would soften the blow. When I remained silent, she walked upstairs to pack. I listened to her moving around the bedroom she'd shared with my son, opening drawers and closets, probably trying to decide which possessions would fit in her suitcase and which she'd have to leave behind. When she came back downstairs 20 minutes later, rolling her suitcase behind her like a reluctant pet, she looked smaller somehow, diminished. The confidence that had always surrounded her like expensive perfume had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked young and frightened and utterly unprepared for the world she was about to face. "The service is at 10 on Saturday," I said as she reached for the door handle. "You're welcome to attend." She turned back, hope flickering across her features. "And afterward? Can we talk? Can we figure out some way to—" "There's nothing to figure out, Stephanie. This is how things are now." She opened her mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I was alone in my house for the first time in 5 years. The silence felt different than I'd expected. Not empty, but full of possibility, full of choices that were finally mine to make. I walked through each room slowly, noting how different everything looked without Stephanie's presence changing the energy. The kitchen where I could cook whatever I wanted without consulting anyone else's preferences. The living room where I could watch my programs without headphones. The guest bedroom that could become a sewing room or an office, or simply a place where I could spread out my quilting supplies without being told they were cluttering up the space. My house, my choices, my life, finally returned to me by a son who had understood, perhaps better than I had, what I'd given up to make room for his wife's vision of our family. I made myself another cup of tea and sat back down in Joel's chair, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. For the first time in years, the future felt like something I could shape rather than something that would happen to me. Outside, a car started in the driveway, Stephanie leaving for the last time as a member of this household. I didn't go to the window to watch her drive away. I had more important things to think about, like what I would do with all this space, all this quiet, all this freedom that my son had fought to give me in his final act of love. The funeral was a study in contrasts that would have amused Bill if he'd been there to observe it. Stephanie arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a brown dress that still had the tags tucked discreetly inside the collar. Another purchase she couldn't afford, made in desperation to look the part of the grieving widow. She sat in the front pew beside me, close enough that I could smell her perfume and hear the quiet click of her fingernails against her phone as she checked messages throughout the service. Behind us, the church filled with people who had actually known my son. His co-workers from the engineering firm where he'd spent the last decade designing water treatment systems for small towns across Iowa. His college friends who'd driven from Des Moines and Cedar Rapids to say goodbye. Neighbors who remembered him as the quiet boy who'd shoveled their sidewalks without being asked, who'd grown into the kind of man who fixed strangers' cars in grocery store parking lots. People who had stories to tell about Bill's kindness, his dry sense of humor, his patient way of explaining complex problems until everyone understood. People who had come not for Stephanie, not for obligation, but because my son had touched their lives in ways that mattered. During the eulogy, I spoke about the Bill they remembered, the boy who'd built elaborate snow forts, the teenager who'd taught himself guitar by watching YouTube videos, the man who'd inherited his father's careful way of measuring twice and cutting once. I talked about his love of terrible science fiction movies, his inability to grow anything in the garden despite years of trying, his habit of calling me every Sunday evening to check if I needed anything from the store. Stephanie spoke next, her voice carefully modulated for maximum emotional impact. She talked about their 5 years of marriage as if they'd been decades, about the life they'd planned together that would now never happen. She mentioned their dreams of traveling, of renovating the house, of the children they'd hoped to have someday, though I knew for a fact that Stephanie had been on birth control throughout their marriage and had told me directly that pregnancy would ruin her figure. But it was the story she told at the end that crystallized everything for me. She described Bill's final weeks as a time when we grew closer than ever, when he found peace knowing I was living life to the fullest. She painted her European vacation as a noble sacrifice, something she'd done at his insistence because he was too generous to want me to suffer alongside him. The congregation listened politely, but I caught the glances exchanged between Bill's friends, the careful neutrality on faces that had seen her Facebook posts from Paris. They knew, as I knew, that grief looked different when it was genuine. Real grief didn't pause to check its reflection in church windows or coordinate its outfit with the season's color palette. After the service, during the reception in the church basement, I watched Stephanie work the room like a political candidate. She accepted condolences with practiced grace, spoke in careful phrases about how difficult this transition would be, and made subtle references to financial concerns that invited offers of help. "Angelica's been such a support," she told Bill's supervisor, loud enough for me to hear from across the room. "But I worry about her. This has been so hard on someone her age. I'm not sure she should be living alone in that big house." The casual way she planted seeds of doubt about my competence, while simultaneously positioning herself as the caring daughter-in-law concerned for my well-being, was masterful. If I hadn't known better, I might have been impressed by her skill at manipulation. But I did know better, and I was done being managed. "Actually," I said, joining their conversation with a smile that felt sharp as glass, "I'm looking forward to having the house to myself again. It's been years since I could make my own decisions about my own space." Stephanie's eyes flashed warning signals, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, but Bill always worried about you being isolated. He mentioned wanting to look into some nice retirement communities, places where you'd have built-in social activities." "Did he?" I turned to face her fully, noting how several people had stopped their own conversations to listen. That's strange, because the last conversation we had about living arrangements, he specifically said the house was my sanctuary and he'd never ask me to leave it. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Stephanie's face cycled through several emotions before settling on wounded surprise. "Well, things change when circumstances change. I just think it would be healthier for both of us to have some space while we process our grief." "Both of us?" "Well, yes. I mean, I assumed I'd be staying in the house while we settle Bill's affairs. It's been my home for 5 years." "Has it?" I let the question hang in the air, watching as comprehension dawned on faces around us. "Because I was under the impression that your home was the apartment you've been keeping downtown, the one where you've been storing all those shopping purchases while my son was dying." Stephanie's composure finally cracked. "Angelica, perhaps this isn't the time or place." "You're right. This isn't the time or place to discuss your living arrangements." I smiled at the small crowd that had gathered around us. "Curtis Fay will be handling the estate details. I'm sure he'll be in touch with you soon about everything." I walked away then, leaving Stephanie to explain herself to Bill's friends and co-workers, to answer the questions that would inevitably arise about why the grieving mother seemed so calm, while the grieving widow seemed so panicked. That evening, after the last casserole had been delivered and the final sympathy card had been opened, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began making lists. Not the careful, tentative lists I'd made for years. Grocery lists that accommodated Stephanie's dietary restrictions. Activity lists that worked around her social schedule. But bold, decisive lists about the life I wanted to build in the space my son had given back to me. First, the house. Stephanie's decorating touches would have to go. The stark white walls that she'd insisted would make rooms look larger. The minimalist furniture that was beautiful but uncomfortable. The abstract art that looked expensive but felt cold. I wanted color again, wanted warmth, wanted surfaces that invited touch rather than demanded distance. Second, my own interests. The pottery wheel I'd sold when Stephanie moved in because she'd complained it made too much mess. The garden club I'd quit because she'd needed help with various projects every Tuesday evening. The book discussions at the library that I'd stopped attending because Stephanie had made pointed comments about how much time I spent dwelling on other people's stories. Third, and most importantly, the relationship with my granddaughter Linda, Bill's daughter from his brief first marriage, now 15 and living with her mother in Burlington. Stephanie had always found reasons why Linda's visits should be shorter, less frequent, less disruptive to the household's carefully maintained adult atmosphere. But Linda was my last living connection to Bill, and to the grandfather she barely remembered. I picked up my phone and dialed Linda's number, something I hadn't done in months because Stephanie had insisted that teenage girls needed space and shouldn't be bothered by well-meaning but overwhelming grandparents. "Grandma Angelica?" Linda's voice sounded surprised but pleased. "Mom told me about Dad. I'm so sorry." "Thank you, sweetheart. I know he would have wanted to see you. Stephanie said the hospital wasn't allowing visitors under 18 because of infection control." Another lie, casual and unnecessary, designed to keep Linda away during the final weeks when Bill had asked about her repeatedly. "That wasn't true, Linda. You could have visited any time." A long pause. Why would she say that? "I don't know. But I want you to know that you're always welcome here. Always. This is your father's house, your grandfather's house. It's your family home, too. Even now, even with everything that's happened, especially now." We talked for nearly an hour about Bill's final weeks, about Linda's sophomore year of high school, about the summer internship she'd been hoping to find in Cedar Falls so she could spend more time with family. By the time we hung up, I had plans to pick her up the following weekend for an extended visit, the kind Stephanie had always found reasons to discourage. 2 days after the funeral, Stephanie returned to collect more of her belongings, accompanied by her mother, a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s, who regarded me with the calculating expression of someone assessing an opponent's weaknesses. "Angelica," Mrs. Schumer said, extending a manicured hand, "I'm so sorry for your loss. And for this unfortunate misunderstanding about Bill's estate." Misunderstanding. As if my son's carefully planned final wishes were somehow a clerical error that reasonable people could negotiate away. "There's no misunderstanding, Lori. Bill's intentions were very clear." "Well, surely there's some room for compromise. Stephanie tells me you're considering downsizing anyway, and it seems wasteful for such a large house to go to someone who—" She gestured vaguely, as if my age and widowhood were disabilities that needed delicate handling. "Someone who what?" "Someone who might benefit more from the security of a managed living situation. There are some lovely places in the area, very dignified with wonderful social programs." Stephanie busied herself packing boxes, but I could see her listening intently to her mother's attempt at diplomatic manipulation. They had clearly strategized this conversation, had decided that direct confrontation had failed, and subtle pressure might work better. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm quite content with my current living situation." "Of course. But practically speaking, maintaining a home this size at your age, the utilities alone must be substantial. And the upkeep, the yard work." Lori shook her head as if the challenges were insurmountable. "It seems like it would be such a burden." "I've been managing the upkeep for 4 years since my husband died. I think I can handle it. But that was when you had Bill nearby to help with the heavier work. Now, with him gone." She let the implication hang in the air like a threat. "Now I'll hire people if I need help. That's what money is for." The mention of money shifted something in the room's atmosphere. Lori's expression sharpened, and Stephanie stopped pretending to pack. "About that," Lori said carefully. "Stephanie mentioned there might have been some confusion about Bill's insurance policies. Surely a young woman who's lost her husband deserves some consideration, some provision for her future. Bill provided exactly what he thought Stephanie deserved. But nothing? Really, Angelica, that seems harsh even for family disputes." This isn't a family dispute. This is the execution of my son's final wishes. Stephanie finally looked up from her box of shoes. What about his debt? What about the car loan? Am I supposed to handle all of that alone? You're supposed to handle the debts you accumulated, just like every other adult in the world. But we planned our finances assuming there would be life insurance to cover. You planned to spend money you didn't have based on your husband's death. That's not financial planning, Stephanie. That's speculation. Lori stepped closer, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. Angelica, I understand you're grieving, and grief can make people act irrationally. But surely you don't want to destroy a young woman's future over hurt feelings. I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply refusing to fund the lifestyle of someone who abandoned my son when he needed her most. She didn't abandon him. She took one trip. She took one trip at the worst possible time, then came back expecting to inherit everything he'd worked for. If you want to help her rebuild her life, you're welcome to do that. But it won't be with money that belongs to me. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, growing more strained as Lori realized I wouldn't be moved by guilt, manipulation, or appeals to fairness that ignored Stephanie's own choices. Finally, they loaded Stephanie's boxes into Lori's car and left with promises to think about our options and consult with attorneys about protecting Stephanie's rights. I waved goodbye from my front porch, then walked back inside and locked the door behind me. That evening, I sat in my garden for the first time in weeks, breathing in the scent of the late-blooming roses that Joel had planted 20 years ago. They needed pruning, needed the kind of attention I'd been too distracted to give them while splitting my time between the hospital and managing Stephanie's moods at home. Tomorrow, I decided, I would call the garden center and order mulch for the flower beds. I would buy the bright yellow mums I'd always loved but that Stephanie had said clashed with the house's color scheme. I would replant the herb garden that had been sacrificed to make room for Stephanie's decorative grasses that looked elegant but served no practical purpose. I would begin the process of reclaiming not just my house, but my life. And if Stephanie and her mother wanted to fight that reclamation in court, they were welcome to try. But they would discover, as my son had discovered in his final weeks, that underestimating Angelica Portman was a mistake that came with consequences. The roses rustled in the evening breeze, and for the first time since Bill's diagnosis, I felt something that might have been peace. 3 months later, I stood in my transformed kitchen, teaching my granddaughter Linda how to make her grandfather's famous apple pie. While autumn light streamed through windows I'd finally been able to open without asking anyone's permission. The secret, I told her as she struggled with the rolling pin, is not to overwork the dough. Your grandfather used to say that pie crust was like trust. Handle it too roughly and it falls apart. Linda, now a confident 15-year-old who'd been spending every weekend with me since the funeral, laughed at the comparison. Did Grandpa Joel really say cheesy things like that? Or are you making it up? He really said things like that. Your father inherited his tendency toward dramatic metaphors. I watched her work, noting how she'd inherited Bill's careful attention to detail, his patient way of approaching problems. He would have loved watching you learn this. The kitchen had been the first room I'd reclaimed, stripping away Stephanie's stark white cabinets and replacing them with warm yellow paint that reminded me of sunshine. The granite countertops she'd insisted on were gone, replaced with butcher block that showed knife marks and flour stains and all the evidence of a kitchen actually used for cooking. Mason jars filled with herbs from my replanted garden lined the windowsill, and the walls displayed Linda's artwork alongside photos spanning 3 generations of family meals. Grandma, Linda said, pausing in her rolling. Mom told me Stephanie tried to contest the will. I had been waiting for this conversation, knowing that Linda's mother Marcia would eventually share the details of Stephanie's failed legal challenge. The court battle, if it could be called that, had lasted exactly 1 hearing. Curtis Fay had presented Bill's medical records proving his mental competency, the properly witnessed documentation of his decisions, and a detailed accounting of Stephanie's debts that made her motivations embarrassingly clear. She tried, I said simply. Mom said she's working at a call center now, that she had to move back in with her parents. I didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on preparing the apple filling. Stephanie's fall from grace had been swift and complete. The BMW had been repossessed within a month when she couldn't make the payments. The expensive apartment she'd hoped to keep had evaporated when she couldn't afford the security deposit for a lease renewal. Her mother's generosity had extended only so far before Lori Schumer decided that her daughter's poor choices were no longer her responsibility to fund. "I feel sorry for her sometimes," Linda continued, watching my face carefully. "Is that wrong?" I set down my knife and looked at my granddaughter. Really looked at her. She had Bill's eyes, Joel's stubborn chin, and an empathy that neither Stephanie nor I had encouraged. At 15, she was already more emotionally mature than many adults I knew, including the woman who had married her father. "It's not wrong to feel sorry for someone who's suffering," I said. "But feeling sorry for someone doesn't mean you're responsible for fixing their problems." "But she was Dad's wife? Doesn't that mean she should get something?" "Your father made his decision based on what he observed during the last months of his life. He saw who showed up and who didn't. He saw who put his needs first and who put their own comfort first." I began arranging apple slices in the pie shell, each piece fitting perfectly into the pattern I'd learned decades ago. "Love isn't just what you say, Linda. It's what you do when doing it costs you something." Linda nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her rolling with new determination. We worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the kitchen filling with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg, before she spoke again. "Are you lonely, now that it's just you in the house?" The question surprised me, not because I hadn't considered it, but because the answer wasn't what I'd expected. Sometimes. But lonely isn't the same as empty. And it was true. The house felt full in ways it hadn't in years. Full of my own choices, my own rhythms, my own priorities. I woke when I wanted to wake, ate what I wanted to eat, watched television programs that interested me rather than enduring shows that someone else had selected. I'd joined a quilting circle that met Thursday evenings, started volunteering again at the literacy program, and discovered that retirement from the library didn't have to mean retirement from learning. Plus, I added, I have visitors now. Real visitors who come because they want to, not because they have to. Linda grinned. Like me. Like you. And like Mrs. Cheryl from next door, who brings me vegetables from her garden because she grows too many for one person. And like your father's friend Wyatt, who stops by sometimes to check on the house, but mostly just wants someone to talk to about missing your dad. Wyatt Schumer, no relation to Stephanie's family, despite the shared surname, had become an unexpected presence in my life. A widower in his early 60s who'd worked with Bill for 8 years, he'd started stopping by in the weeks after the funeral with transparent excuses about checking my gutters or testing my smoke detectors. What he really wanted was someone who understood that grief wasn't a problem to be solved, but a weight to be carried, and that sometimes the carrying was easier when shared with someone who knew how heavy it could be. Is Wyatt like, your boyfriend? Linda asked with the directness that only teenagers could manage. Wyatt is my friend, a good friend who knew your father and loved him, and who treats me like a person worth knowing rather than a problem to be managed. It was more than friendship, actually, though neither Wyatt nor I had felt the need to define it precisely. He brought me coffee on Sunday mornings and stayed to read the newspaper at my kitchen table. I cooked dinner for him on Wednesdays and listened to his stories about the engineering projects he and Bill had worked on together. We attended movies and concerts, took long walks through the downtown district that had been revitalized since I'd stopped paying attention to such things, and discovered that companionship at 64 looked different than romance at 24, but felt no less valuable. Does it make you angry? Linda asked suddenly. What Stephanie did? I considered the question while I crimped the edges of the pie crust, thinking about anger and justice and the difference between punishment and consequence. It did, at first. But anger is exhausting, and I don't have energy to waste on people who've already proven they don't deserve it. But don't you want her to, I don't know, suffer? For how she treated Dad. She is suffering. Natural consequences are often more effective than anything I could design. I slid the pie into the oven and set the timer. Your father was a good man who deserved better than he got from his wife. But he made sure that her choices wouldn't continue to hurt the people he loved. That's enough justice for me. Linda helped me clean up the flour and apple peels, and we settled into the living room with glasses of cider to wait for the pie to bake. The room looked nothing like it had during Stephanie's tenure. Gone were the uncomfortable modern couches and the glass coffee table that had made everyone afraid to set down a drink. Instead, I'd furnished it with pieces that invited relaxation. A deep sofa covered in warm burgundy fabric, an ottoman large enough for 2 people to share, side tables that could hold books and coffee cups and the comfortable clutter of daily life. "Grandma," Linda said, curling into the corner of the sofa, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" "Of course. Are you glad Dad changed the will? Even though it hurt Stephanie?" I looked at my granddaughter, this brave young woman who was willing to ask difficult questions and sit with complicated answers. She deserved honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. "I'm glad your father protected what mattered to him. I'm glad he ensured that the people who loved him unconditionally would be taken care of. I'm glad he didn't reward someone for behavior that hurt him." I paused, choosing my words carefully. Am I glad Stephanie is struggling financially? No. But am I willing to sacrifice my security and future to cushion her fall? Also no. That seems fair. Fairness is complicated, sweetheart. What seems harsh to one person feels like justice to another. Your father had to make a choice about what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. He chose to protect the people who had protected him. The timer chimed, and I retrieved the pie from the oven, its crust golden brown and perfect. The smell filled the house with warmth and memory, connecting this moment to countless others when this kitchen had been the heart of family celebrations. "Will you teach me to make Grandpa's pot roast next weekend?" Linda asked. "I'll teach you anything you want to learn." As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Linda and I ate our pie and planned her spring break visit, her summer internship at the library, the college tours we'd take together when the time came. She would be the bridge between my past and whatever future awaited me, the living continuation of everything Joel and Bill had built and valued. At 8 o'clock, Wyatt arrived for our weekly chess game, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the comfortable smile of someone who belonged in my space. Linda hugged him goodbye. They'd developed their own friendship over these months, bonded by their shared love for Bill and their appreciation for terrible puns. "How was your day?" Wyatt asked as we set up the chessboard, the question carrying the weight of genuine interest rather than polite obligation. "Full," I said, "in the best possible way." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the house that was finally, completely mine. Somewhere across town, Stephanie was probably sitting in her childhood bedroom in her parents' house, surrounded by the remnants of a life she'd built on assumptions that had proven false. I hoped she was learning something from the experience, though I no longer felt responsible for ensuring that she did. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcia, Linda's mother. "Thank you for today. She came home so happy. She needs family right now, especially family who remembers her father as more than his illness." I smiled, typing back, "She's welcome here anytime. This is her home too." Because that was what family really meant. Not the legal contracts or shared addresses, but the choice to keep showing up for each other, even when showing up was difficult. Even when the world shifted around you and left you standing in unfamiliar territory. Wyatt captured my queen with his knight, and I laughed at my own distraction. "You're getting too good at this game. You're getting too good at other things," he said, like knowing what you want and not apologizing for it. I had good teachers, Bill, and Joel, and even Stephanie in her way. She taught me what I didn't want to become. We played until nearly midnight, talking and laughing and sharing the kind of easy companionship that develops between people who've both learned that happiness isn't something that happens to you, but something you choose to create from whatever materials life provides. When Wyatt left, kissing my cheek at the door like the gentleman he'd always been, I walked through my house one final time before bed. Every room held evidence of the choices I'd made over these 3 months. Books stacked on tables where they could be easily reached, quilting supplies spread across the dining room table, Linda's school projects magneted to the refrigerator beside pictures of 4 generations of family. This was what winning looked like, I realized. Not the dramatic satisfaction of watching an enemy fall, but the quiet contentment of building something good from the pieces left behind after loss. Not revenge, exactly, but something better. The reclamation of a life that had always been mine, even when I'd been convinced to live it according to someone else's specifications. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, where Joel's picture still sat on my nightstand and Bill's childhood drawings still decorated the walls. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new possibilities, new ways to fill the space that had been returned to me. And for the first time in years, I was excited to discover what those choices might be. In her parents' house across town, Stephanie was probably lying awake calculating debt payments and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. But that was her story to write now, her consequences to navigate. Mine was just beginning. Now, tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.